Rome is not merely a city, nor is it simply an empire. Rome is an unusually long story about how humans organize power, justify violence, and convince themselves that the order they live under is natural, reasonable, and permanent. When we say, the history of Rome, what we are really describing is not a list of dates or emperors, but a massive social experiment that lasted for more than 1,000 years, an experiment in governing people at a scale that had rarely been attempted before. What makes Rome remarkable is not that it conquered the Mediterranean world. Other empires have done that, sometimes faster and sometimes with fewer resources. Rome's uniqueness lies in the fact that it never stopped explaining itself. Every generation of Romans reinterpreted the past in order to justify the present. Every political change was framed as a return to traditional Roman values. Every crisis was described as a temporary deviation from the true Roman way of doing things. Rome, from the beginning, understood that stories are power. If you can explain why your system exists, why it is normal, and why it deserves loyalty, then you can survive mistakes, defeats, and even internal collapse. Rome mastered this long before it mastered the art of empire. That mindset is visible right at the very beginning. In Rome's origin story, unlike many foundation myths, Rome's is not gentle or comforting. There is no peaceful divine blessing, no golden age of harmony. Instead, there are abandoned infants, violence between brothers, and a city founded through bloodshed. The myth of Romulus and Remus does not try to hide this brutality. It places it front and center. The message is unmistakable. Rome exists because it was willing to do what others could not. Power does not come from purity, moral perfection, or divine favor alone. Power comes from decisive action, even when that action is cruel. In Rome's own story about itself, the survival of the community matters more than personal bonds. Order matters more than mercy. This origin myth is not just a story, it is a psychological blueprint. It teaches Romans that the state comes before the individual, that stability is worth sacrifice, and that harsh decisions can be morally justified if they protect the community. From the very beginning, Rome imagined itself as a society that had to be hard in order to survive in a hostile world. But embedded in this self-image is a contradiction that will haunt Rome for centuries. Romans despised kings, yet they consistently needed strong leaders. According to tradition, Rome's early kings were both builders of institutions and threats to freedom. The overthrow of the last king was not just a political shift, it was a collective trauma. From that point forward, never again a king became a sacred principle. This fear of kingship shaped everything that followed. The Romans did not eliminate power, they fragmented it. Instead of one ruler, they created overlapping offices, short terms, and systems of mutual oversight. On paper, this was a brilliant design. It was meant to prevent tyranny by making it impossible for any single individual to dominate the state for long. In practice, however, this system rewarded those who were clever, ambitious, and ruthless enough to bend the rules without technically breaking them. The Republic did not remove the desire for absolute power. It simply forced that desire to operate indirectly. The Roman Republic, therefore, was never a democratic paradise. It was a delicate balancing act among competing elites. The Senate represented an aristocratic class that believed leadership was their birthright. Ordinary citizens had political power in theory, but in practice their voices were often guided, manipulated, or ignored when inconvenient. Political office was not a selfless duty, it was a step in a long career of prestige, wealth, and influence. And yet, this flawed system worked, at least for a while. Its flexibility and pragmatism allowed Rome to expand with extraordinary speed. Rome did not insist that conquered peoples become culturally Roman overnight. Instead, it tolerated difference as long as order was maintained and taxes were paid. Roman citizenship itself became expandable, something that could be granted rather than guarded jealously. This inclusiveness was not driven by idealism. It was driven by utility. But it worked. It gave Rome allies instead of endless enemies. It allowed Rome to absorb other societies rather than simply ruling over them by force. Still, every solution Rome invented carried long-term consequences. Expansion brought wealth, slaves, and prestige, but it also created distance between the political center and the realities of life on the frontiers. Armies, once instruments of the state, slowly became personal tools of ambitious generals. Soldiers were loyal not to abstract republican ideals, but to the men who paid them and promised them land and reward. This shift introduces one of the most dangerous questions in Roman history. Where does real power actually reside? In laws and institutions, or in the hands of those who command violence? Rome's history is often told as a triumphant rise followed by a tragic fall. But even during its ascent, the seeds of instability were already present. Rome repeatedly solved short-term crises by creating exceptions, bending norms, and establishing precedents that undermined the system in the long run. Each emergency solution made the next emergency more likely. This is why the more interesting question is not, why did Rome fall? But, why did it last as long as it did? Rome existed in a constant state of tension, between ideals and reality. Between law and force. Between freedom and order. That tension drove its success. But it also guaranteed that conflict would never truly disappear. Rome matters because it shows us what happens when a society believes it is the center of the world. Its story is not unique, but it is unusually well documented and brutally honest. In Rome, we can watch a civilization argue with itself for centuries about power, identity, and survival. In the next part, we will see how the Republic's fragile balance finally begins to fracture when personal ambition, political violence, and military power collide, pushing Rome toward a future it fears but cannot escape. The Roman Republic did not collapse all at once. It began to fail slowly, unevenly, through a series of decisions that made sense in the moment and proved disastrous in hindsight. The system that had once balanced ambition against restraint now started amplifying ambition instead. Rome had grown too large, too wealthy, and too unequal for its old political mechanisms to manage without strain. At the heart of the problem was success. Rome's victories brought enormous wealth into the city, but that wealth did not spread evenly. Conquered land was increasingly absorbed by large estates owned by the elite, while small farmers, once the backbone of the Roman army, were pushed off their land. These displaced citizens flooded into Rome itself, forming a growing urban population with political rights but little economic security. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Politicians began competing not just for honor, but for the loyalty of the masses. Public office became a tool for personal advancement rather than collective stability. Laws were proposed not because they strengthened the republic, but because they weakened rivals. Politics turned from negotiation into combat by other means. The Gracchi brothers are often remembered as reformers who tried to address these inequalities. Their proposals to redistribute land were, in theory, attempts to restore the old Roman balance. In practice, they shattered a crucial norm, that political disputes should not be settled through violence. When both brothers were killed for challenging elite interests, the Republic crossed an invisible line. From that moment on, force became an acceptable answer to political disagreement. Once that boundary was broken, it could not be repaired. Future politicians learned a clear lesson: if you threaten powerful interests, you must be prepared to use power yourself, or be destroyed. Rome had not yet fallen into civil war, but it had normalized the idea that political survival might require bloodshed. The next major shift came with the army. Traditionally, Roman soldiers were citizens who served temporarily and then returned to their farms. But as those farms disappeared, the army changed. Reforms associated with Marius opened military service to landless citizens, transforming the army into a profession. This solved an immediate manpower problem, but it also changed where loyalty lay. Soldiers now depended on their generals for pay, loot, and retirement land. The state became an abstraction. The general became reality. This is the moment when Rome's political struggles turned existential. An ambitious man with an army was no longer just a politician. He was a potential alternative government. Sulla demonstrated this brutally. When political rivals threatened his authority, he marched his army on Rome itself, an act that had once been unthinkable. He seized power, rewrote the constitution, and attempted to restore the republic by force. Ironically, in trying to save the system, he taught everyone else exactly how to destroy it. Sulla eventually stepped down, believing he had fixed Rome. He had not. What he left behind was not stability, but a precedent. The lesson was clear: if you have enough soldiers, you can take the city. The Republic still existed on paper, but its moral authority was gone. Into this environment stepped Julius Caesar. Caesar did not invent Rome's problems, he exploited them. He understood that popularity, military success, and narrative control mattered more than formal legality. His conquest of Gaul gave him not only wealth and prestige, but an army fiercely loyal to him personally. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he was not making a sudden decision. He was acting within a system that had already taught him that hesitation meant destruction. His civil war was framed as a defense of Roman liberty, even as it concentrated power in his own hands. This contradiction was not accidental. It was Roman politics functioning exactly as designed. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Republic. It proved that the Republic no longer had the tools to survive. Killing a man did not kill the conditions that produced him. Instead, it triggered more chaos, more civil wars, and more consolidation of power. By the time Augustus emerged victorious, Rome was exhausted. The people did not crave freedom, they craved stability. Augustus understood this perfectly. He did not call himself king. He did not abolish the republic. He preserved its language, its symbols, and its rituals, while quietly removing its substance. What Rome accepted under Augustus was a trade. Political participation was reduced, but peace was restored. Open conflict disappeared. Roads were safe, and food was plentiful. The Republic had feared monarchy for centuries. Yet in the end it embraced something far more durable. An empire that looked like tradition while functioning as autocracy. The tragedy of the Republic is not that it failed, but that it failed logically. Each step followed from the one before it. Each crisis narrowed the range of acceptable solutions until only one remained. Rome did not fall into empire by accident. It reasoned its way there. In the next part, we will examine how the Roman Empire functioned once this transition was complete, and why the very stability that made it powerful also planted the seeds of long-term stagnation and vulnerability. Once the Roman Empire was firmly established, it entered a phase that later generations would romanticize as its golden age. This period, often called the Pax Romana, was not defined by constant conquest or dramatic political change, but by something far rarer in ancient history: long-term stability. For the first time in centuries, most people living under Roman rule could reasonably expect that tomorrow would look much like today. This stability was not accidental. It was the result of a carefully managed system in which real power flowed through the emperor. While traditional institutions remained in place as a kind of political theater, the Senate still met, magistrates still held office, laws were still passed in familiar ways. But the crucial difference was that none of these bodies could function independently of imperial approval. For ordinary citizens, this arrangement was often an improvement. The chaotic violence of the late Republic was gone. Civil wars ended, roads were maintained, cities expanded, and trade flourished across an interconnected Mediterranean world. The empire became a machine that converted order into prosperity, and prosperity into loyalty. Yet this system came with an unspoken condition: it depended entirely on the quality of the person at the top. A competent emperor could keep the machinery running smoothly. An incompetent one could grind it to dust. The Republic had been inefficient, but it was resilient. Power was distributed, allowing mistakes to be corrected over time. The empire was efficient, but brittle. The early emperors managed this tension with varying degrees of success. Augustus ruled not as a tyrant, but as a careful administrator of perception. He understood that Romans did not need to love him, they needed to believe that he was preserving their traditions. His successors inherited this framework, but not always his restraint. Some emperors governed well, surrounding themselves with capable officials and respecting the illusion of shared power. Others ruled through fear, paranoia, or indulgence. The problem was not that bad emperors existed, that had always been true, but that the system provided no safe way to remove them without violence. Over time, the empire's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Stability discouraged adaptation. As long as the system functioned, there was little incentive to change it. Bureaucracy expanded, administration became more complex, and decision-making slowed. The empire could manage routine governance with remarkable efficiency. but it struggled when confronted with unexpected crises. Meanwhile, the size of the empire created its own challenges. Governing a vast territory required immense resources, constant communication, and a standing army large enough to defend distant borders. This meant higher taxes, more officials, and increased pressure on local economies. The empire was not collapsing, but it was growing heavier. The military, once again, played a central role. Emperors depended on the loyalty of soldiers, and soldiers increasingly understood their leverage. As succession became uncertain, armies began backing their own candidates for the throne. The idea of the emperor as a neutral guardian of order gave way to the reality of emperors as winners of internal power struggles. This period saw a slow erosion of trust in the system. People still identified as Roman, but the connection between citizenship and political influence had faded. The empire offered security and material benefits, but fewer opportunities for meaningful participation. Rome was stable, but distant. By the 3rd century, the accumulated pressures became impossible to ignore. Economic strain, political instability, and external threats converged into a series of crises that exposed how fragile the imperial system had become. Emperors rose and fell at alarming speed. Frontiers were breached. Confidence in central authority weakened. What made this moment particularly dangerous was not the presence of problems, but the absence of solutions within the existing framework. The old republican mechanisms were long gone, and imperial authority had lost its aura of inevitability. Rome could no longer rely on tradition alone to hold itself together. In response, the empire began to transform. This was not a collapse, but a reconfiguration. Power was reorganized, administration was divided, and new ideological foundations were introduced. The Rome that emerged from this process would look very different from the one Augustus created. In the next part, we will explore how the empire reinvented itself through crisis, splitting power, redefining loyalty, and embracing new beliefs that would permanently change what it meant to be Roman. The crisis of the 3rd century forced Rome to confront a truth it had long avoided. The imperial system as it existed could no longer sustain itself. Rapid turnovers of emperors, economic instability, and constant pressure along the borders revealed that the empire was too large, too complex, and too fragile to be governed the old way. Survival now required transformation rather than tradition. One of the most important shifts came with the recognition that no single ruler could effectively manage the empire alone. Power began to split, not as an ideological choice, but as a practical necessity. Administrative regions were reorganized, authority was delegated, and the empire moved toward a more structured bureaucracy. This reduced the burden on any one individual, but it also changed the relationship between the center and the provinces. Rome was no longer a city ruling the world, it was a system ruling itself. Diocletian embodied this new approach. His reforms did not attempt to restore the past. Instead, they accepted that the past was gone. By dividing imperial authority among multiple rulers, he sought to impose order through structure rather than personality. The empire became more rigid, more hierarchical, and more explicitly authoritarian. Citizens were categorized, professions became fixed, and mobility declined. Stability was preserved, but at the cost of flexibility. This new Rome was less romantic but more resilient. It functioned like a machine designed to survive constant stress. Yet even this system required something more than laws and soldiers. It needed a unifying idea that could bind people together across vast distances and cultural differences. Traditional Roman religion, closely tied to civic ritual and local identity, struggled to fulfill this role. Christianity entered this vacuum at precisely the right moment. Once a persecuted sect, it offered something the empire desperately needed: a universal belief system that transcended ethnicity, language, and geography. When Constantine embraced Christianity, he was not simply making a personal spiritual choice. He was adopting a new ideological glue for the empire. This shift fundamentally altered what it meant to be Roman. Loyalty was no longer based solely on citizenship or participation in civic life, but on shared belief and moral identity. The emperor became not just a political leader, but a protector of divine order. Authority gained a sacred dimension that the old republic would have found deeply unsettling. As these changes took root, the empire's internal map began to look increasingly uneven. The eastern provinces, wealthier and more urbanized, adapted well to the new structures. The western regions, facing economic decline and constant invasions, struggled to keep up. Over time, this imbalance grew impossible to ignore. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, it did not do so in a single dramatic moment. Institutions faded, authority fragmented, and power shifted into local hands. To many living through it, this did not feel like the end of the world. Life continued, just under different rules, different leaders, and different names. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire carried on. It preserved Roman law, administration, and imperial identity for nearly 1,000 more years. This raises an uncomfortable question. If Rome continued in the East, did it truly fall at all? Or did it simply change its shape? What we call the fall of Rome is better understood as a transformation. Rome did not disappear, it dissolved into the foundations of medieval Europe. Christian institutions, and modern concepts of governance. Its influence became less visible, but more pervasive. In the final part, we will look at Rome's lasting legacy, and why, long after its political power vanished, the Roman way of thinking still shapes the world we live in today. Rome's true power did not end when its emperors disappeared or when its legions stopped marching. In many ways, that was when Rome became most influential. Stripped of its armies and political unity, Rome transformed from a ruling force into a conceptual framework, a set of ideas about law, authority, citizenship, and civilization that outlived the state itself. Roman law is perhaps the clearest example of this afterlife. Long after emperors fell, Roman legal principles continued to shape how societies defined rights, contracts, and justice. The idea that law should be written, systematic, and theoretically applicable to all citizens did not vanish with the empire. Instead, it became a foundation for medieval kingdoms, early modern states, and eventually the modern legal systems that still govern much of the world today. Architecture tells a similar story. Roads, aqueducts, and cities built by Rome remained in use for centuries, not because people admired Roman aesthetics, but because the infrastructure worked. Rome did not just conquer space, it reorganized it. Even when new rulers took power, they ruled from Roman cities, used Roman roads, and governed populations that still thought in Roman terms. Language, too, carried Rome forward. Latin fractured into regional dialects that became the Romance languages, spreading Roman influence into everyday speech. This was not cultural preservation, it was cultural mutation. Rome survived not as a single identity, but as many overlapping ones. More subtly, Rome shaped how later societies imagined power itself. Medieval emperors, Renaissance republics, and modern nation-states all looked back to Rome for legitimacy. Some tried to recreate it. Others defined themselves in opposition to it. But almost none ignored it. Rome became the default reference point for what an empire looked like, what authority meant, and how history should be remembered. Perhaps the most important legacy of Rome is its warning. Rome demonstrates that strength and stability are not permanent conditions. Systems built to prevent tyranny can evolve into systems that enable it. Structures designed to preserve order can slowly erase participation. Rome did not collapse because it was uniquely corrupt or foolish, it collapsed because it was human. That is why Rome still matters. Not because it was exceptional, but because it was representative. Its story shows how power grows, how it justifies itself, how it adapts under pressure, and how it eventually changes form. Rome is not a relic of the past, it is a mirror. When we study Rome, we are not simply learning about ancient history. We are examining a pattern that repeats whenever societies expand faster than their institutions can adapt. The Roman world reminds us that decline is rarely sudden, collapse is rarely clean, and transformation is almost always misunderstood while it is happening. Rome never truly ended, it became invisible, embedded in laws, borders, languages, and assumptions about governance that we no longer recognize as Roman because they feel normal. That may be Rome's greatest achievement, and its most unsettling lesson. Rome's true power did not end when its emperors disappeared or when its legions stopped marching. In many ways, that was when Rome became most influential. Stripped of its armies and political unity, Rome transformed from a ruling force into a conceptual framework, a set of ideas about law, authority, citizenship, and civilization that outlived the state itself. Roman law is perhaps the clearest example of this afterlife. Long after emperors fell, Roman legal principles continued to shape how societies defined rights, contracts, and justice. The idea that law should be written, systematic, and theoretically applicable to all citizens did not vanish with the empire. Instead, it became a foundation for medieval kingdoms, early modern states, and eventually the modern legal systems that still govern much of the world today. Architecture tells a similar story. Roads, aqueducts, and cities built by Rome remained in use for centuries, not because people admired Roman aesthetics, but because the infrastructure worked. Rome did not just conquer space, it reorganized it. Even when new rulers took power, they ruled from Roman cities, used Roman roads, and governed populations that still thought in Roman terms. Language, too, carried Rome forward. Latin fractured into regional dialects that became the Romance languages, spreading Roman influence into everyday speech. This was not cultural preservation, it was cultural mutation. Rome survived not as a single identity, but as many overlapping ones. More subtly, Rome shaped how later societies imagined power itself. Medieval emperors, Renaissance republics, and modern nation-states all looked back to Rome for legitimacy. Some tried to recreate it. Others defined themselves in opposition to it. But almost none ignored it. Rome became the default reference point for what an empire looked like, what authority meant, and how history should be remembered. Perhaps the most important legacy of Rome is its warning. Rome demonstrates that strength and stability are not permanent conditions. Systems built to prevent tyranny can evolve into systems that enable it. Structures designed to preserve order can slowly erase participation. Rome did not collapse because it was uniquely corrupt or foolish, it collapsed because it was human. That is why Rome still matters. Not because it was exceptional, but because it was representative. Its story shows how power grows, how it justifies itself, how it adapts under pressure, and how it eventually changes form. Rome is not a relic of the past, it is a mirror. When we study Rome, we are not simply learning about ancient history. We are examining a pattern that repeats whenever societies expand faster than their institutions can adapt. The Roman world reminds us that decline is rarely sudden, collapse is rarely clean, and transformation is almost always misunderstood while it is happening. Rome never truly ended. It became invisible, embedded in laws, borders, languages, and assumptions about governance that we no longer recognize as Roman because they feel normal. That may be Rome's greatest achievement, and its most unsettling lesson. When we say that Rome ended, what we usually mean is that its symbols disappeared. The emperors vanished. The legions stopped marching under a single banner. And the city itself lost its position as the unquestioned center of the world. But symbols are only the surface. Beneath them, Rome continued quietly, embedded in habits of thought that no longer felt ancient. This is why Rome feels strangely familiar no matter how distant it is in time. We recognize its arguments because we still use them. We debate order versus freedom. We worry about inequality hollowing out institutions. We rely on systems that work so well, for so long, that we stop questioning whether they can adapt. Rome does not feel foreign because, in many ways, we are still living inside its shadow. The Romans believed deeply in continuity. Even in moments of extreme change, they framed the present as a restoration of the past. That instinct, to explain transformation as tradition, is one of Rome's most enduring inheritances. It is comforting. It makes disruption feel controlled. But it also delays honest confrontation with reality. Rome teaches us that civilizations rarely collapse because people stop believing in them. More often, they collapse because people believe in them too much, so much that they cannot imagine alternatives until the old structures have already changed beyond recognition. By the time the language shifts from reform to decline, the transformation is long underway. And yet, Rome's story is not pessimistic. It is sobering, but not hopeless. Rome endured precisely because it could adapt. Even imperfectly, it absorbed defeats, restructured power, redefined identity, and survived in forms no one at its founding could have predicted. Its endurance reminds us that continuity does not require stasis, and survival does not guarantee familiarity. To study Rome, then, is not simply to study the past. It is to study scale, ambition, and consequence. It is to see how human systems stretch, strain, and eventually reshape themselves under their own weight. Rome is not a warning carved in stone. It is a process, one we recognize because it keeps happening. In the end, Rome was never a single thing. It was a city, a republic, an empire, a church, a legal tradition, and an idea. Each version believed it was Rome. None of them were entirely wrong. That may be the most Roman lesson of all.